This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.
Hi, and welcome to Smarter Lawcast with Hall & Wilcox. My name is Mark Dunphy, and I'm a partner in the Employment and Workplace Relations team at Hall & Wilcox. Today, I'm joined by my friend and partner, Faye Calderone, from our Employment and Workplace Relations team. And today we're going to be discussing flexible work and return to office or return to work in the post-pandemic world. Now, Faye, they may say that you're a futurist, but having known you now for quite a while, I know you've been talking about the need for flexible work to become the new normal for years before the pandemic. I'm keen in why you have always thought it's so important and why it's going to be important moving forwards.
Thanks, Mark. It's not quite the new normal we had in mind, but certainly COVID has provided a burning platform for change. And I think what we need to do is, I suppose, take the best of what COVID has given us in having, all the naysayers and the people that were resistant to flexible working on board now, and put the worst of it with lockdowns behind us. But look, to go back, the reason that I've been advocating for a while now for flexible work, probably over a decade, is that it's recognised as basically the structural foundation for healthy and inclusive workplaces. We know the barriers women in particular face as the primary carers often in a return to work. We know that there's a low take up in their progression. There's a low take up in their return to work, but also progression once they've come back to work. There's pay gap increases, of course, when women are balancing family responsibilities, and it was recognised that that flexible working was a mechanism to remove some of those structural barriers and help women balance their responsibilities. But more to the point, and what we were talking about more recently before the pandemic, was that in order for there to be a greater equaliser in the workplace and for women to progress, that more men had to be taking up flexible work as well, because only then does the baseline become the same for both sexes. It means that there is a more shared responsibility at home, which means that their shared care means the ability to progress as well. Both parents within a household, and the real issue was, I think, pre-pandemic, and I'm hoping the pandemic will sort this out, or will at least reduce the stigma that men faced for taking flexible work, because it was recognised and statistically proven that men were more likely to suffer adverse consequences in their career and progression for taking it, which is a real problem for everyone.
I think that's right, and yeah, things are being accelerated. Now, with regard to working from home, Faye, it used to be seen pre-pandemic, I guess, really as a privilege or an accommodation that employers would provide to employees. But now we're starting to see a shift with regard to that, and we're starting to see businesses make noises about implementing no jab, no office policies. So to an extent, it'll be a privilege or an accommodation to enable you to come to the office. Interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it is fascinating, isn't it? And I think it is quite interesting because, like we said at the start, I mean, what we're experiencing at the moment is not normal. Having every member of the household under the same roof, including children and homeschooling, is not normal. So what we envisaged and what we enjoyed pre-pandemic in terms of flexible work and the ability to have a day to catch up and retreat is not really what we're experiencing at the moment. So yes, there is quite a bit of rhetoric about a race back to the office, and there's quite a few jokes, I think, circulating about people escaping to the office to escape their families. But in all seriousness, I think this is going to be a very interesting and nuanced situation that we're going to see emerge, because as we know, there's COVID circulating in the communities. The Delta is highly infectious and highly problematic, and to the extent that we are all able to work from home and without disadvantage, I mean, we've been doing so, particularly office workers, we're talking about now for quite some time. It's in lawful and reasonable direction for an employer or workplace to issue to say, in the interest of the health and safety and to protect people and our workers and visitors in the office, you need to be vaccinated to return to the office. And if you're not, then you're working from home. You're still being paid, and you still have the benefit of work. So I think to the extent that the two things have intersected in that our ability to pivot to flexible working and provide income security and business continuity during the pandemic is equally the reason why it's lawful and reasonable and employers are able to issue this direction for people to stay at home as we have been. But I think there is really a desire to return to the office, and I think that the interesting thing will be how the dual workforce evolves over time, because we've always had people that worked flexibly because of carers responsibilities or because of disability or other reasons that of course they're entitled to ask for flexibility under the Fair Work Act, but they have never been precluded from the office. And so I think we're going to have sort of three categories of workers, or four actually. We'll have the people that go into the office all the time because that's what they want to do. That we'll have the hybrid workers by choice. We'll have the people that work flexibly in accordance with formal work requests that are more difficult to change by policy, and then we'll have this interesting exclusion of a portion of the workplace because they're unvaccinated. And I think it's going to take some management and leadership to progress with a unified workplace and a positive workplace culture with managing all those differing situations and obligations.
I can imagine Fate's going to throw up a myriad of legal issues in the employment law space when you have employees who, in a white collar environment particularly, who have been able to work well during the pandemic from home, but then we'll have employers that insist that they get better productivity and a better result from their collective employers if they are together in the office. Do you anticipate there being disciplinary and termination issues open to employers who have employees that refuse to get vaccinated and come back?
Look, I think it will be, I mean, it will always come back to the level of COVID that's circulating in the community and whether it's a lawful and reasonable direction in the first place. But assuming that it is, it really will be a question of whether or not there can be that ongoing accommodation. I think for office workers where they have been working flexibly, whether or termination of employment is the next logical step is going to be a difficult and an interesting situation. I mean, we're managing a lot of these at the moment, as you know, Mark, in our team with clients, but clients that have got frontline workers, clients that are working with where there's public health orders and people are working with the vulnerable, or even in the absence of public health orders, we can say, if people are working with Indigenous populations at the moment, there's no public health order, but it's a lawful and reasonable direction. You need to be interfacing, with those vulnerable clients in the community sector, and if you can't do that, or if you refuse to be vaccinated, then it's entirely reasonable. There's no way to accommodate that remotely, and therefore your termination is the next logical step. In our industry, I think it's going to be interesting to see whether we can progress to a termination when people refuse to be vaccinated on the basis that up until now it's been convenient and appropriate for people to work from home during the pandemic. So why can't they continue to work from home? It'll be interesting, but I think some brave employers will take it on, and we'll probably get some guidance and good law as a result.
Yeah, and you mentioned that the reasonableness of directions in that space, can depend on many factors, including the amount of COVID circulating in the community at any point in time. So I gather then that a direction to return to work or a mandate to return to work might have a different impact in different geographic areas or different states, depending upon where they're at in a COVID sense.
That's right. It will go to the reasonableness of the direction. I mean, it's not an unlawful direction to issue, but it will be a question of whether it's reasonable in those particular circumstances. I think the interesting thing we'll see play out maybe today or tomorrow, it's reasonable for us to issue a direction in relation to the Sydney or Melbourne CBD, for example, but not necessarily in Perth. There's no COVID circulating in the community at the moment that we know of. The issue is going to be, however, and I know you and I have chatted about this, is when when borders do open, and inevitably, eventually, they will have to open. And we spoke at the start about burning platforms and the burning platform for change that COVID has created, and it's certainly at the same time you can see that there's been a burning platform for vaccination in Sydney and Victoria. And so, whereas, the vaccination rates in areas where COVID isn't circulating in the community are lagging behind. So, as borders open, it's reasonably foreseeable that COVID will enter those communities, and that people will be less protected in those communities if the vaccination rates don't increase or accelerate very rapidly. So I think reasonableness of that direction, I think will eventually be appropriate across jurisdictions, even if it isn't today.
Faye, one thing I've heard you talk about previously with great interest is the concept of proximity bias when there is the ability for people to come to work. So by that, I'm assuming that you mean that the risk of those, or the opportunities for those working in the office or out of the office, as the case might be greater than it might be for others in the opposite camp. Interested in your thoughts on how that might play out and some of the legal issues that might get thrown up there.
Yeah, look, it's a concept that obviously it's based on how people work. I mean, it's the human condition, and to some extent, there are people that are creatures of habit, and they've always worked in the office, and this has really, rocked them, destabilized them, but in some cases, pleasantly surprised them. But there will be many people that rush back to the office as they did after the previous lockdowns, and old habits die hard. They will, be people that work in the office 5 days a week, even if there is hybrid working arrangements or the ability to work from home. They will choose to work in the office. The concept of proximity bias is basically having a bias towards or increased tendency to work with those that are closest to you. And now we're not going to say that someone that's working in the office will necessarily consciously say, you have to be in the office in order to get a pay rise, or you have to be in the office in order to get a promotion. We know that would be particularly in circumstances where there are formal flexible work arrangements based on discriminatory grounds. It would be discrimination. Of course, there are policies that most or many employers have adopted that say, we encourage flexible working and hybrid working arrangements. So that would be anti-policy. But the issue is more about the creep and the unconscious issues that develop, where if you are constantly giving people work that are sitting around you, when it does come to pay and progression, is it not a risk that though they are the people that have had the highest levels of productivity, the highest successes in their careers, and therefore in that year, and therefore it is a natural consequence that they are the ones that will have higher pay increases and progress more rapidly. So I think it's a real issue that we need to consciously navigate, and I think we need to be very deliberate in the choices that we make in how we distribute work and how we manage hybrid teams, but also to have some HR people, independent people during remuneration, discussions or promotion discussions that are really stress testing some of these concepts to make sure that we don't create a dual workplace where those that are working from home are inevitably disadvantaged because of the consequences throughout the year.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot to play out in that space, and I think that managers and those allocating work, again, particularly in a white collar environment, are going to have to be very, very conscious of those that are around them, and even more particularly those that are not around them. So there'll be some behaviours I think that need to change.
Absolutely.
Faye, the Fair Work Act for many years now has had provision for flexible work requests, and now that many workplaces are implementing hybrid working policies themselves, I'm interested in your view about whether the legislation still has work to do for those in those workplaces.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Look, there's probably less work to do than it had to do before. But as you know, I mean, it's broader than just remote working or the ability to work from home. It applies to flexible hours, flexible start and finish times, part-time arrangements. So those things currently aren't contemplated necessarily in flexible working or hybrid policies. It's more about where people work rather than the pattern and hours of work, although there are some consequences there in terms of flexibility. But I do think there are also many workplaces that are and many managers that are keen to get back to work, and once the opportunity that flexible working currently provides in terms of business continuity subsides and people are able to return to the office, they will insist people return to the office, and not everyone is implementing these hybrid working arrangements, so there will still be work in terms of those arrangements, those requests that employees that have carers responsibilities or that have health conditions or that otherwise meet those criteria, including being over 55. Those people can still make those requests formally. Of course, the Fair Work Act only prescribes a process. It doesn't necessarily mandate or require employers to offer flexible work. It simply requires them to provide reasons why they say it's unreasonable in all the circumstances. But I do think this is going to be a very interesting thing to play out because the secondary, obviously, legal risk is discrimination. So if someone, for example, makes a request for flexible working and they say they have a particular medical condition that requires them to work from home, it's a question of whether or not it's a reasonable adjustment that the employer can make, and that reasonable adjustment should impose an unjustifiable hardship on the employer. It's going to be very difficult, I think, for employers to argue that when we return to work, someone that has been working flexibly all this time, productively, efficiently, otherwise hitting their mark, it's going to be very difficult to argue that those people cannot be accommodated and that these adjustments aren't reasonable in the future. So I think, again, we might see some cases playing out there.
And Faye, maybe finally, I'd like to make an observation and interested in your thoughts on it. And that is that from clients that I speak to, and there's dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, over the course of a year, I would make the observation that those who take a more rigid view to hybrid working and are more demanding on getting people back into the office, that they would seem to represent a disproportionate number of the claims that I have from employers, and those that demonstrate more flexibility and are more willing to embrace a hybrid model seem to have a happier workforce and thus less claims. Do you think that's a valid observation, and do you see the same things with your
Absolutely.
clients?
Absolutely, and it was one of the platforms for advocating for flexible work to start off with. It's that the next generation wants autonomy. We know high performance teams work best where in environments that are less autocratic, that are more decentralized leadership and working arrangements that provide people with structures in terms of what expectations are, what outputs are, but otherwise autonomy about how how they deliver and when they deliver, and provided that they hit their objectives and their KPIs, that high performance teams actually deliver better results in those circumstances. And I think the flip side to that is the more we control, the more rigid we are, the more we clock watch on our employees, the more they're likely to do the same with us. I mean, if you sort of watching the clock and telling people that they're 10 minutes, it's just at the most basic level, they're 10 minutes late to work, and you're tapping the watch and going, well, how are you going to make up for this? They're not going to put in the extra 20 minutes on the other side. They'll only give you the extra 10. It's just, if you look at it at the most basic level like that, I think that is, the human condition that we see playing out. We need to enable and empower people to thrive. Otherwise, we won't get the best out of them. And unfortunately, you and I, Mark, tend to see things at their worst, not at their best. So if people are talking to you, it's not when everything's humming along beautifully, sadly. Unless they're just having a beer with you at the pub on the weekend.
Well, that's completely consistent with what I see, Faye, but it still never ceases to surprise me the extent to which many employers still don't see that embracing hybrid and flexible working has real tangible benefits for them as a business.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, terrific. Well, look, I want to thank everybody for listening to today's episode. Flexible work and return to work is certainly a really hot topic, and we're going to be seeing a lot more happening in this space, and there's going to be a lot of jurisprudence evolve as the return to work gains momentum in Australia. I want to really thank Faye for being so generous with her time. Faye has done a lot of thought leadership over time in this space, and I encourage any of you to follow her on social media, and you'll see she regularly has commentary in this space. Otherwise, if you have any questions, please contact a member of our Employment and Workplace Relations team. You'll find our details on our website, hallandwilcox.com.au, or you can connect with us on LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review, and follow our podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. And you can subscribe to our website to be notified of new episodes. Thanks for listening.